Imagine meeting a philosopher whose greatest achievement was not a political empire, a military victory, or a collection of luxurious possessions, but the creation of a place where people could simply learn how to live well. More than 2,000 years ago, in the changing world of the Hellenistic age, a man named Epicurus devoted his life to that task. Before becoming the founder of one of antiquity's most influential philosophical traditions, however, he was simply a Greek man trying to understand what makes life worth living. Epicurus was born around 341 BCE on the island of Samos. His family had Athenian origins, which would later connect his life with Athens and its extraordinary intellectual environment. His childhood unfolded during a period when the world inherited from the classical Greek city-states was being transformed. The conquests of Alexander the Great had changed the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek culture had spread far beyond the traditional homeland, and individuals increasingly found themselves living in a world much larger and more uncertain than the old polis. Growing up in such an environment meant encountering questions that were becoming increasingly important to Hellenistic philosophers. Political power could change rapidly, familiar institutions could disappear, and circumstances beyond an individual's control could determine the course of an entire life. Epicurus became deeply interested in the problem hidden beneath all of this uncertainty. If the world cannot always be controlled, how can a human being still live well within it? His education brought him into contact with earlier philosophical traditions, particularly the atomist ideas associated with Democritus. These influences would become important throughout his intellectual development, although Epicurus was never simply a follower repeating someone else's conclusions. He developed his own understanding of the world and eventually built a philosophical system that connected ideas about nature with questions concerning human existence. That connection was essential to his personality as a thinker. Epicurus did not see philosophy as an activity whose purpose was merely to produce clever arguments. A philosophical idea mattered because of what it could do for the person who understood it. If knowledge did not make life clearer, calmer, or more manageable, its practical value was questionable. For that reason, Epicurus approached philosophy almost as a way of training oneself to live. He wanted people to examine the fears and expectations that shaped their behavior and to ask whether those forces actually deserved the power they had over them. Intellectual curiosity was important, but it was connected with something more personal, the desire to live without being constantly disturbed by unnecessary concerns. Eventually, Epicurus made his way to Athens and established his own school around 306 BCE. The community became known as the Garden, or Ho Kippos. Its name has survived as one of the most recognizable symbols of Epicureanism, but the place itself tells us something important about the philosopher. Epicurus did not create an institution designed to impress the outside world. The garden represented a different model of philosophical life. Rather than making philosophy dependent upon wealth, public reputation, or political influence, he created an environment where people could study, converse, and build a shared way of life. The character of the garden was closely connected with Epicurus himself. His philosophy was not something completely separate from his everyday existence. The simplicity associated with the community reflected the values of its founder. There was no need to surround oneself with unnecessary luxury in order to experience satisfaction. Ordinary circumstances could be enough when a person knew how to appreciate them. This is particularly important because the modern meaning of the word Epicurean can be misleading. Today it often evokes expensive meals, luxury, indulgence, and an almost obsessive pursuit of physical pleasure. The historical Epicurus was far removed from that image. His own lifestyle was famously modest, and he often emphasized the value of simple food and uncomplicated circumstances. The distinction reveals something fundamental about his character. Epicurus was not interested in collecting as many pleasurable experiences as possible. He was interested in understanding which experiences genuinely improve life and which merely create new problems. A person could become accustomed to luxury and eventually find ordinary things disappointing. Another could remain satisfied with very little and therefore become less dependent on external circumstances. His attitude toward material life was therefore practical rather than ascetic. He did not need to condemn every form of comfort. Instead, he questioned the assumption that greater consumption automatically produces greater happiness. A comfortable existence could be enjoyable, but dependence upon comfort could also make a person vulnerable. This way of thinking fitted naturally with the community he created. The garden was meant to provide an environment where philosophical reflection could become part of ordinary life. Its members were not simply expected to memorize doctrines. They were encouraged to live according to the values they studied. Epicurus also placed enormous importance on the relationships between people. Letters preserved from his circle reveal how closely personal relationships were connected with his philosophical life. The garden was a community, not merely a classroom, and that distinction helps explain why Epicurus became such a personal figure for his followers. People remembered his character as well as his teachings. His school continued after his death because his followers did not see Epicureanism merely as a collection of abstract propositions. It represented a particular form of existence that they believed could be practiced. Another striking feature of Epicurus was his distance from the traditional pursuit of public prestige. Ancient Greek culture placed considerable value on reputation, political achievement, and recognition. Epicurus increasingly turned away from those goals, seeing the pursuit of status as something capable of producing dependence and instability. For him, an impressive life was not necessarily a successful life. Someone could possess influence and still be miserable. Another person might live quietly, surrounded by a few trusted companions, and experience a far greater sense of security. That contrast became central to the atmosphere surrounding the garden. Epicurus offered his followers an alternative to the constant competition for recognition. A person did not need to become famous in order to have a meaningful existence. Nor did philosophical achievement require defeating everyone else in an intellectual contest. His approach was especially suited to the changing world in which he lived. The old political structures of the classical period had been transformed, and philosophical communities increasingly offered individuals a place where they could search for stability. Epicurus responded to that historical situation by making the quality of personal existence the central concern. This helps explain why he remains interesting as an individual rather than merely as the founder of a school. His life shows a deliberate attempt to make his surroundings correspond with his convictions. He created a community that embodied the kind of existence he considered desirable. The garden therefore became more than a location in Athens. It became a symbol of the life Epicurus wanted to construct. A quieter existence, intellectual companionship, modest circumstances, and freedom from unnecessary pressures were not merely theoretical ideals. They were part of the environment he built around himself. His followers preserved this tradition after his death, and Epicurean communities eventually appeared far beyond Athens. The school survived for centuries, attracting people who were drawn to the possibility of a life less dominated by ambition and fear. Yet the reputation of Epicurus changed dramatically over time. Opponents often portrayed his philosophy as an excuse for indulgence, while later popular culture transformed his name into a synonym for refined luxury. The irony is that the historical philosopher associated with that word had repeatedly emphasized moderation. Understanding this difference allows us to see Epicurus more clearly. He was not trying to teach people how to obtain everything they wanted. He was interested in the opposite problem: why human beings want so much in the first place, and whether all of those desires deserve to control their lives. That question belonged to the personality of the philosopher long before it became a formal part of a philosophical system. Epicurus observed the anxieties created by ambition, uncertainty, competition, and social expectations, and he searched for a different model. His answer was not an escape from the world. He still lived among other people, maintained relationships, studied nature, taught students, and participated in the intellectual culture of his time. What he rejected was the assumption that a meaningful existence required constant pursuit of external success. There is also something deeply human in the way Epicurus approached philosophy. He did not imagine that people could eliminate every difficulty from existence. Life would still contain illness, disappointment, loss, aging, and circumstances beyond personal control. His ambition was more realistic. He wanted human beings to avoid adding unnecessary suffering to difficulties that already existed. That practical concern became one of the defining characteristics of his legacy. Epicurus eventually died in Athens around 270 BCE. Accounts of his final days portray a man who remained connected with his friends and students even while experiencing serious physical suffering. His death marked the end of his own life, but not the end of the community he had created. The garden continued, his followers preserved his writings, and later generations carried his ideas into the Roman world. His influence would eventually reach thinkers and writers who approached his philosophy in very different ways. Yet all of that later history begins with one individual. A man born on Samos during a period of enormous transformation. A philosopher shaped by earlier Greek thought but unwilling simply to repeat it. A teacher who believed that philosophy should matter in ordinary life. And the founder of a garden that became one of antiquity's most distinctive experiments in philosophical living. Before Epicureanism became a system with its own terminology and debates, there was Epicurus himself. His life provides the starting point for understanding why this tradition appeared and why it continued to attract people long after its founder was gone. He was not a ruler attempting to reshape the Mediterranean through force. He did not seek immortality through political glory. His ambition was considerably quieter. He wanted to understand how a human being could live well. And then he attempted to build a life around that question.